Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Starking AM0184. This watch is available from Starking official store on AliExpress for €67. So firstly, let's look at the box that the watch comes in, and then I'll talk you through the other items one gets with a piece. So the watch comes in this cardboard watch box. One removes the tray from the sleeve, and the watch sits in the base of the tray inside a foam cutout panel, as one would expect. Although basic, it does suffice in protecting the watch in shipping from any damage, and I think it's perfectly acceptable to use a basic cardboard watch box, bearing in mind this is a low tier price point piece at only €67. With regards to the items, this is the international warranty card, and I'm pleased to report the watch is covered by a 12-month international warranty. Now, there's no owner's instruction manual, and that's a disappointment. I would like to see Starking introduce an owner's instruction manual to detail the operation of the movement used, which is the Starking Caliber SK1813S Automatic. This is the tag that comes to the watch. And on the reverse, we have the full reference number for the piece, which is abbreviated to AM0184. One also gets this plastic bracelet resizing tool used for pushing out the push pins in the bracelet, so nice to get this included. And lastly, one also gets this Starking branded microfiber polishing cloth. I always think it's a nice touch to get a branded microfiber polishing cloth, irrespective of the price point of a piece. So, with regards to the specifications of the piece, this is the Starking AM0184. We have a 40mm case diameter. We have a 48mm lug-to-lug measurement, a thickness of 11.5mm, and a lug width of 20mm. The bracelet tapers from 20mm at the lugs down to 18mm at the 2-button push deploying clasp. As you can see, the deploying clasp is unsigned, it's sterile, and I would like to see Starking engrave it either with their emblem or alternatively Starking logo text, because that would add interest to the clasp. Now, with regards to the taper, I think they've made a mistake because this is a 40mm head of the piece, but the taper of the bracelet is 20 down to 18, and I don't think it's enough of a taper. It looks straight and parallel. It would look better balanced if it were tapered from 20 down to 16, which is the industry standard. 22 to 18 is the industry standard taper, or alternatively 20 to 16. I don't think 20 to 18 is enough. It just looks too straight. And it means that the bracelet feels heavy versus the piece. It doesn't feel balanced, and it makes the bracelet feel too heavy for a 40mm piece. 20 to 18, it really feels like the kind of bracelet that should be on a 41mm piece. So, with regards to the rest of the specifications, we have a flat sapphire crystal. Now, the negative of the flat sapphire crystal is there is no AR coating on the underside. And when I tilt the piece at an oblique angle, you can see there is a lot of glare and highly reflective nature due to the silver mirror polished applied indices and the silver mirror polished Dolphin hands. So this really does need clear AR coating on the underside, because as you can see, it's like a mirror and it does reflect. So I think they've made the correct decision by using a flat sapphire crystal rather than double dome sapphire crystal, because that does reduce the thickness of the head of the piece down to only 11.5, which is very good for an automatic. 11.5 is the kind of thickness one would expect with a manual wind or quartz powered piece, not an automatic. Now, the legibility of the dial is good despite the lack of the AR coating. Perfect symmetry to the applied indices. The white date wheel with black Arabic numerals is clearly legible at 3 o'clock, and we've got just the right amount of information. Starking with the brand emblem at 12 and just automatic. They haven't put any irrelevant information such as 50 meters water resistance. This is a daily wear piece or a dress piece, so therefore one doesn't need to know anything else such as the water resistance rating as per a dive piece. The mirror polished Dolphin hands are very well finished, and I like the faceted profile to them, and they are well proportioned. The minute hand extends nearly to the white minute ticks on the chapter ring. The hour hand is also correctly proportioned, and the second hand is also long enough to nearly extend to the minute ticks. So the proportions of the Dolphin hands look correct, and also using Dolphin hands with these triangular shaped applied indices works very well. So symmetry is good, legibility is good, but the only negative really is the lack of AR, as you can see, because it's very shiny like a mirror. So with regards to the crown, it's knurled finish, solid 316L grade stainless steel, and engraved to high standard with the Starking emblem. So it's a push-pull crown which provides an effective hermetic seal to 50 meters, which is perfectly acceptable for a daily wear or dress piece. Let's test the screw-down crown execution. As it's a push-pull crown rather than screw-down crown, in the closed position one can manually wind the Starking Caliber SK1813S Automatic to top it up to its maximum 35-hour power reserve. Now, there's a lot of resistance in it. It doesn't feel pleasant to manually wind. One can feel the tension in the mainspring building up, but it doesn't feel as smooth as an NH35A or a Miyota 8215, and I think that they should have considered using one of those two movements, the 35A or the 8215, because they are smoother to manually wind, and they do have a date complication, so they would be suitable for this AM0184. So one can feel the tension building up, but it does feel very stiff, and it takes a lot of torsion in order to turn the crown and wind up the mainspring. So pulling it out to the first click position is the quick set date complication. Now I'm just going to move the hands out of the way to show it to you better. Right, so now looking at the date complication, rotating the crown clockwise in the first click position is the quick set complication. The date does click over to the next day of the month with a positive click, but it feels lighter in terms of resistance. It doesn't have the same positive clicking sensation as an NH35A, which I actually prefer. I prefer the heavier quick set complication of a 35A because each click of the month has a nice solid index. This feels lighter, so it's actually easier to go past the month one once. It doesn't have the same firm heavy click, and it's a very light action, so it does take some getting used to. It feels more similar to a Miyota 8215 in terms of the resistance of the quick set complication. Pulling it out to the final click position is the time setting position, and as you can see, the caliber SK1813S does have hacking. If you look at the second hand, it's possible to stop the second hand dead to set the time precisely to the second. Now again, it's got a very firm resistance to the gearing, and I dislike this because it's an indication of poor build quality. There's a lot of friction in the gearing to the caliber SK1813S. It doesn't feel as smooth as a Miyota 8215 or an NH35A, which have lighter resistance, and one can really feel the friction in the jewels and also the gears, and it just doesn't feel pleasant to set the time. Now the other thing to note is there is some back play clockwise and anti-clockwise. When one rotates the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise, there isn't an immediate response from the minute hand. It doesn't immediately move, so one has to rotate the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise more in order to take up the back play in the gearing in the movement. And again, this is an indication of it being a lower grade quality movement than the 8215 or the NH35A. The 8215 does also have similar back play clockwise and anti-clockwise, but this is something that Seiko movements such as the 35A don't have. When one rotates a 35A crown clockwise and anti-clockwise, the minute hand immediately responds. There's no back play whatsoever. So there's room for improvement on it, and again, this is a reason why I would prefer if they used a higher grade of movement such as the 35A. Pushing it back in has got a nice positive click, and that restarts the movement. The second hand begins to sweep around the dial once again. So the push-pull crown works okay. It doesn't feel pleasant to manually wind, it doesn't feel pleasant to operate the quick set complication, and it doesn't feel pleasant to set the time. There's a lot of resistance in the gearing in all of those aforementioned operations, so I really think that the 8215 or the 35A would have been a better choice, but I appreciate this is only €67, and therefore Starking have elected to use their own in-house caliber SK1813S in order to cut production costs. With regards to the caseback, it's a screw-down exhibition caseback glazed with mineral crystal. Milled slots are done very well, no sharp edges, no burrs, mirror polished to a good standard around the circumference of the stainless steel portion. The mineral crystal is flat and also has a slight lip to it. It's low profile, bearing in mind it has to house the rotor on the underside. And they've also added a gilded Starking emblem to the centre to add interest. It's engraved with the specification and the reference number to a good standard, so the quality of the screw-down exhibition caseback is good, and I like that it's relatively low profile for an automatic. It does a good job of displaying the Starking caliber SK1813S. Now, it's a basic undecorated movement with the exception of the blued screws, but however it is nice to have an exhibition caseback on a low-tier piece costing only €67. Now, with regards to the clasp, as I've detailed, it's sterile, and that's a cost-cutting measure. I prefer to see it engraved with the emblem or Starking text logo. 2 pushers to the deployant, good foam resistance, and both halves of the deployant open freely. The mirror polishing is done to an acceptable standard on the top side, underside and flanks, and both halves snap shut with a nice positive click. It's not going to accidentally deploy when one presses one of the pushers. One has to press both of the firm pushers in order to get it to deploy, so it does snap shut and open as one would expect, although there is room for improvement with regards to the finishing of the clasp. Now, with regards to the bracelet, there are some clear cost-cutting measures. If you look closely at the end link, which I'll show you, this one's very stiff. You can see, if you look at the end links, there are areas on the end links which are unfinished. They're simply machined finish, and I think there's room for improvement on the quality of the finishing. Although looking at the top side, one can see the mirror polishing and also the brush satin finishing is done to an acceptable standard, bearing in mind the price point of the piece. But however, there is lateral side to side play, longitudinal play and up and down play in the end link, as you can see, and also every one of the links which use push pins rather than screw pins as a cost cutting measure, there is significant play, lateral side to side play, up and down play and longitudinal play in every single one of the links. So the bracelet rattles and it makes an annoying rattling sound when on the wrist. Now I'll just check the other side for comparison. Again, we've got female pivoted end links, but they don't articulate. They're very stiff, as you can see. So really, it's negligible having female pivoted end links. These actually feel and look like male end links because the end link in the bracelet doesn't actually move beneath the case very well, and it feels stiff. It doesn't articulate smoothly. Now again, we also have lateral side to side play, up and down play and longitudinal play in every direction in the end link, and also every single one of the links has significant play in it. So it rattles. And it's annoying when it's worn on wrist. If you wear it loose and you don't size the bracelet tight around your wrist, you can actually hear the bracelet rattling about. Now on a positive note, it does articulate very well due to being loose. There are no stiff links, it doesn't kink. But as you can see, look at the edge of every single one of the links in the bracelet, and you can see they are unfinished. And this is an area one expects with cost-cutting production costs. So this is €67. So this is the kind of finishing level one expects in the low tier. High quality bracelets have the end of the links in every one of the links finished. They mirror polish the ends, as you can see. They don't just leave them machined. But this is a cost-cutting measure, and the quality of this bracelet really lets down the head of the piece because the quality of the mirror polishing to the flanks is actually done to a good standard. The quality of the mirror polishing to the bezel is also done to a good standard. It's solid 316L grade stainless steel bezel, solid 316L grade stainless steel head of the piece. Brush satin finishing to the tops of the lugs is also done to a good standard. No sharp edges to the underside of the flanks. And we don't have any sharp corners to the tips of the lugs. So the quality of the head of the piece is good, but it's let down by the poor quality finishing to the bracelet. And on the underside it contrasts with brush satin finishing rather than being mirror polished as a cost-cutting measure. Now the other negative is they haven't engraved direction arrows. Usually with pushpin bracelets they have engraved arrowheads on one side of the flank, and that tells you which way to push out the pushpins out of the bracelets, and then you reverse that direction when pushing the pushpins back in after removing links. But with this one doesn't know which way to push the pushpins out of the bracelet, so this is a cost-cutting measure, and I feel that it's a step too far. Even though this is €67 and one has to expect some cost-cutting measures, the cost of engraving arrowheads on the underside to a bracelet is negligible to Starking. So really they need to have arrowheads because one could mistakenly push out the pushpin the wrong way and therefore damage it, and therefore one cannot reuse it. So one really does need arrowheads engraved on one side to the underside of the flank. Right, so I'll give you wrist shots and you can see how it fits on my 8-inch wrist. Now I haven't sized the bracelet, I've simply taken it out of the watch box, and as you can see it fits my 8-inch wrist perfectly with no links removed. So this will fit you if you're a collector with a larger wrist of 7 to 8 inches. 8 inches is the maximum. Now, it does have wrist presence. It's a 40mm, but it actually wears more like a 41. It is very flat and low profile at only 11.5, and that's something I like about it. The angular lugs wrap around the wrist very well with a nice snug fit. There's no gap underneath the lugs. They have a very angular profile to them, which curves down very quickly to the wrist. It's just a shame they use these female pivoted end links which don't actually articulate very well, but on a positive note, due to the angular profile of the lugs, it does pull the bracelet close to the wrist in any case, but I think male links would have actually looked more aesthetically pleasing because the female pivoted end links have a large abhorrent gap, as you can see. So the mirror polishing to the bezel is done very well, the mirror polishing to the flanks with an undercut is done very well, and the brush satin finishing to the head of the piece is done well. I think the lugs look too long. They are nice and slender, but I think they've made the lugs too long, and therefore the female pivoted end links also look too long because they have this large gap. So they could have shortened the lugs. The lug to lug measurement though is 48mm, which, as you'll know from my previous reviews, is the sweet spot. 48 is the perfect lug to lug measurement, regardless of whether you have a 6 to 7 inch wrist or a 7 to 8 inch wrist respectively. It gives a good fit regardless of whether you have a smaller wrist or a larger wrist, but it's spoiled by the taper, which is incorrect. 20 down to 18 isn't enough of a taper on the bracelet. Had they made this 20 to 16, it would feel far more balanced. As it is, it feels like the head of the piece is lighter than the bracelet, rather than the 40mm head of the piece balancing the bracelet, which is how it should feel. So it doesn't feel top heavy, it actually feels the reverse of top heavy. It feels like the bracelet is too heavy than the head of the piece, which actually feels lighter. So I think this would be more comfortable worn on a leather strap, and it would also enhance the piece because a leather strap would have more taper from 20 to 16 down to the buckle and tang. And I really dislike the straight look of the bracelet links from 20 to 18. It looks like a straight parallel bracelet rather than being tapered. Now, the biggest problem this piece has, the main negative, as I've previously discussed, is the lack of AR coating. The symmetry of the dial and the dolphin hands is very good, and one can clearly read the date complication because it's white date wheel with black Arabic numerals. But the problem is, even with a matte black dial rather than a glossy black enamel dial, which would be more reflective, it really does have a very shiny and reflective sapphire crystal. So I really think that they should have increased the price point above €67 retail and added AR coating, because collectors would happily pay an additional €5 on the retail price in order to get AR coating. So as you can see, it's very difficult to read when it reflects the light. So feel good factor is good, comfort level is okay. I'm not going to say the comfort level is excellent or good because of the taper on the bracelet. It does feel like a very heavy bracelet on a light head of the piece. 139 grams with all the links in the bracelet, and that is heavy. If this had 20 to 16 taper, it would reduce the heft to circa 120 to 125 grams, and that would make it more wearable. Bearing in mind this is a daily wear or dress piece, so it's going to be worn for long periods of time, such as 8 to 12 hours per day. So there's no loom, therefore we won't do a loom test, so I'll move on to discussing the movements. So this uses the Starking Caliber SK1813S automatic. It has 25 joules and it runs at 28,800 vibrations per hour and a frequency of 4 Hz. It has hand winding and hacking, which use for complications, and also has a quick set date complication, which I've demonstrated. Now, there are some negatives to the Caliber SK1813S. The first negative, the main negative of the movement, is it has a low power reserve. It's only 35 hours. And for an automatic, 40 hours is now the industry standard. 35 hours power reserve really is unacceptable. Now, I appreciate this is only €67 and Starking have had to cut production costs, and therefore they've used their own Caliber SK1813S rather than using a Miyota 8215 or alternatively a Seiko NH35A, because they're more expensive, being imported from Japan and Malaysia respectively. But this is a step too far, because 35 hours means that you either have to wear this every day for 8 to 12 hours in order to keep it running, or alternatively you have to manually wind it every day. And as I've detailed, it's stiff to manually wind, it doesn't feel pleasant. Another problem with manually winding it is the crown, which is knurled finish, actually feels undersized. It's actually very difficult to grip. So it feels stiff to turn. One needs a lot of torsion, and also it's hard to get a grip with one's index finger and thumb in order to manually wind it. So after turning this 40 times, your finger and thumb actually feel sore. It's not a pleasant watch to manually wind. So that's a negative, 35 hours versus 40 hours. Had they used the 8215 or the NH35A, they have 40 hours power reserve. One doesn't need to manually wind them daily, and also one doesn't need to wear them for 8 to 12 hours per day to keep them running. Now, it has some other negatives. It has a unidirectional winding rotor. So what that means is the rotor can spin both clockwise and anti-clockwise, but this movement can only wind when the rotor spins in one direction, anti-clockwise. When the rotor spins clockwise, it has negligible winding effect. So when wearing the piece, the rotor always has to spin anti-clockwise in order to wind it. And so it's not as efficient as the NH35A, which has a bidirectional winding rotor, and I prefer it for that reason. The other negative to the movements is it has a noisy rotor, and to put the noise into perspective, the sound of the rotor bearings sounds loud, it's audible on wrist, one can hear it spinning round. It sounds very similar to a Miyota 8215, which also has a noisy rotor, and it's also unidirectional. So it's inefficient because it's unidirectional, it's noisy, and it only has 35 hours, which is a low power reserve. On a positive note, it does run at 4 Hz rather than running at a 3 Hz frequency. So I'll put that into perspective. If you look at the second hand, you can see that it sweeps around the dial smoothly at 4 Hz. It runs at 28,800 vibrations per hour. The 8215 and the NH35A are 3 Hz movements. They have a more of a stutter or a judder to the second hand because the movement runs at 21,600 vibrations per hour. So I do like the 4 Hz sweep of a movement running at 28,800. It does look smoother rather than ticking or stuttering or juddering around the dial as per a 35A or an 8215. But really, it's not a worthy sacrifice to have a 4 Hz movement. What they've done is they've increased the frequency to 4 Hz in order to give the second hand a smooth sweep. But by doing that, they sacrifice power reserve. Now, I think they should have left it at 21,600 vibrations per hour and 3 Hz. Yes, the second hand would judder and stutter as per an 8215 or an NH35A, but they could have enhanced, by doing that, the power reserve from 35 to 40 hours. So they would have increased it by 5 hours by reducing the frequency and the beat rate. So really, I think they've made a mistake using the Starking Caliber SK1813S. The 8215 or the 35A would have been better options. So lastly, I'll summarise the piece. What do I think of it overall? Well, when I'm considering reviewing a watch on my channel, the watch will meet 2 criteria. It should be both excellent quality and excellent value at the respective price point. So this is €67. Yes, it's an inexpensive piece, so I have to say it is good value because at €67 this doesn't face any stiff competition. But however, I'm going to say the quality is poor because the end links are very stiff in the female pivoted end links and they're poorly finished. Also the rattling to the bracelet and the lack of AR coating, and the main negative, which I've detailed, is the Starking Caliber SK1813S, which is an inefficient movement. It's noisy and of course only 35 hours, and it's not pleasant to manually wind due to the stiff crown. So I really think there are better options at €67. I'm going to say the value is good, but the quality is poor, and therefore I cannot recommend it to you for consideration. I hope you've enjoyed my review of the Starking AM0184. Please feel free to post your own comments below the video. Thank you very much.